From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Full and unconditional, Washington reacts to President Biden's decision to pardon his son Hunter, set to be sentenced this month on federal tax and gun crimes. We'll have insights from former federal prosecutor Jessica Roth and from our political panel. Lawmakers return to Washington today to face a government funding deadline and new questions about Donald Trump's new pick to run the FBI, Kash Patel, who has vowed to dismantle the agency. And as we approach the transition of power here in Washington, we sit down with a diplomat in the center of it all. British Ambassador to the U.S., Karen Pierce, joins on the strength of soft power here in our nation's capital. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It was exactly what Joe Biden repeatedly said he would not do. The president announcing a full and unconditional pardon of his son Hunter, who was set to be sentenced this month on tax and gun crimes. The criticism immediate from around the political spectrum, with President-elect Trump asking on social media, does the pardon given by Joe to Hunter include the J6 hostages who have now been imprisoned for years? Such an abuse and miscarriage of justice, unquote. Democrats responding as well. More recently, Senator Gary Peters of Michigan posting President Biden's decision to pardon his son was wrong. The president's family and allies should not get special treatment. This was an improper use of power. It erodes trust in our government and emboldens others to bend justice to suit their interests, unquote. Joining us now with more on our top story is Bloomberg government's Kate Ackley. Kate, the big question everyone asking here beyond why is what changed? The Biden family got together for Thanksgiving, as they do each year on Nantucket, and the culmination of that gathering was this announcement.
And some of the timing, and I don't know that we're all going to figure it out tonight, but he was going to be sentenced this month.
Yep.
So, you know, a lot of the times we saw the more controversial pardons happen just on the, January 19th on the way out the door. But this preempts the sentencing that would have happened this month. Mm-hmm. That's some of the insight that we have. But you're right. It's how big the pardon is, how all-encompassing it is. It has attracted sort of a negative response even from some Democrats on Capitol Hill who have said that it's going to make it harder for them once Biden leaves office to criticize incoming President Trump and anything that he might do that has to do with his family or pardons or what have you.
Well, a lot of questions about his own legacy after running on the idea that no one is above the law. When you read the pardon, though, a lot of folks have made comments about the breadth and scope of this pardon. For those offenses against the U.S. which he has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 1, 2014 through December 1, 2024. It's not just the crimes he was going to be sentenced for this month. There apparently was an expectation for more. Is that how you read this?
It seems like it. I mean, like you said, it's a blanket of this almost, 11-year period. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? Does that preempt the incoming Trump administration? And you mentioned a new FBI nominee. Was there some sort of fear going through the Biden family at that Thanksgiving gathering that they needed to preempt something that they thought was not a legitimate
Well, you're getting to it here. We spoke earlier with Nick Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor, who said this pardon would never have happened if Donald Trump hadn't won the White House and subsequently named some folks like you just referred to, Kash Patel included, that led the Biden family, or President Biden here specifically, to think that this is different now. Something has changed since he made that promise.
And we won't know if I think he said even after the election, or the White House had said even after Donald Trump was, declared the president-elect, that he would not, that President Biden was not planning to pardon his son.
Yeah.
We won't know, though. If the election had turned out differently, we won't know.
We will not. Kate Ackley, it's great to have you with us, reporting for Bloomberg Government on our top story here as we turn abroad as the world watches Syria. President Bashar al-Assad reportedly flying to Moscow after the city of Aleppo was taken over by rebel fighters. The situation presenting a foreign policy challenge to both President Biden and President-elect Trump. And that's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg's Dan Flatley reporting from our national security team. Dan, just broadly, to keep people up to date, a lot of folks missed what was happening. It was very quick over the weekend to see these rebel fighters move through Aleppo. They're heading south now. How much of the country have they occupied, and what's the latest that you know?
Well, certainly they're moving very quickly. And to your point, Joe, Bashar al-Assad flew to Moscow to try to touch base with his benefactor, Vladimir Putin, who has his own war that he's prosecuting in Ukraine. So very different situation than we had in the mid-2000s or the mid-2010s, where Assad was receiving support from Russia and Iran in terms of fending off these rebel fighters. So it'll be interesting to see how all this plays out. Certainly, as you mentioned, this is a problem not just for Biden, but for incoming President-elect Donald Trump. Yep. And if you'll recall, in April, I think it was 2018, there was a airstrike on Syria. One of Trump's first acts as commander-in-chief, one of his most significant acts was an airstrike over the use of chemical weapons in Syria. So it's amazing to me, actually, that here, almost 8 years later, we're talking about the same same set of situations, same set of problems. And so how this plays out, I think, will be something. There's always something unexpected whenever you have world events unfolding, and this is certainly something that was not on any of our cards.
That's for sure.
Going into the
You wonder how it plays into the Tulsi Gabbard confirmation hearings as well, should they emerge. Donald Trump taking to social media again today to weigh in on the situation in Gaza. Demanding the release of hostages by the time he takes office, is sworn into office January 20, or they'll be held to pay. Who would pay? Who is he talking about?
Very unclear at this point, Joe, obviously. You know, President-elect Trump has made many pronouncements on social media over the last several days, including tariffs on Canada and Mexico. He's now talking about the hostage situation in Gaza with regard to Israeli hostages being held there. You know, if you talk to folks around the president-elect, people who are supporting him, people who he has nominated for key positions like National Security Advisor, they talk about him bringing back deterrence to the office. Whether that means employing U.S. troops or U.S. firepower to somehow bring this situation to a close with regard to the hostages or not, you know, that's unclear. It would be out of character sort of with the notion that he is trying to bring American troops home. He wants to reduce the number of involvement, you know, of places where we're involved overseas. But it doesn't rule out an airstrike. It doesn't rule out perhaps a special operations strike that could be carried out discreetly in the future. Certainly, he did a drone strike against Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iranian general. So there are all those cards on the table, but we don't have many details at this point about what exactly he means.
Hopefully much more to follow here, at least in our understanding of what's going on. Dan Flatley, thank you so much for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up on Bloomberg TV and radio, the implications of President Biden's broad pardon of his son Hunter and the selection of Kash Patel as director of the FBI with Jessica Roth, professor at Cardozo Law School, former federal prosecutor. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm extremely proud of my son, Hunter. He has overcome an addiction. He's one of the brightest, most decent men I know. And I am satisfied that I'm not going to do anything. I said I abide by the jury decision. I will do that, and I will not pardon him.
President Biden in June saying that he would not pardon his son Hunter, a statement that did not age well, as yesterday the president reversed that decision, offering a full and unconditional pardon to his son for any offenses between January 1st, 2014 through December 1st, 2024. The pardon coming with just weeks left, of course, to the Biden administration. And joining us now is Jessica Roth, professor at Cardozo Law School and former federal prosecutor for the Southern Districts of New York. Professor, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. There are a lot of questions today, and I may ask you a few about what this means for Joe Biden's legacy. But in terms of the timing of this decision, was this brought forth, do you suspect, by some of the names that Donald Trump has suggested to run the FBI, to run the Justice Department? Why this late decision by a president who seemed to have already made up his mind?
Well, I think it's a reasonable inference that there's a connection between some of the names that Trump has been putting forward as his intended nominees to run the FBI and to run the Department of Justice and this decision. The decision also, of course, came at the end of a holiday weekend, Thanksgiving, when Joe Biden was with his family, including Hunter Biden. One imagines that also played a role. But it's surprising. It's surprising in part because Joe Biden has said repeatedly that he was not intending to and would not pardon his son. It's surprising because of the breadth of the pardon. I mean, that's extremely unusual. It's for any and all potential crimes that Hunter may have committed over a very long period, I think from 2014 up until the present. Usually pardons are specific with respect to particular crimes that a person has been charged with or convicted of. And so I'd say in particular, it's that breadth that does suggest the connection between the names like Kash Patel that have been put forward, who has spoken about using the Justice Department and the FBI to take vengeance on Trump's enemies and on Joe Biden and his family. So I think when you put together all of that circumstantial evidence, yeah, I think it's a reasonable inference that there's a connection there.
I spoke on the early edition of Balance of Power with Nick Ackerman, the former assistant special Watergate prosecutor. Here's what he had to say about the timing in this case.
If Harris had won the election, I don't think there would be a pardon. But I don't think he really trusts a Justice Department that's headed by Pam Bondi, Donald Trump's two defense lawyers from New York, and Kash Patel, who is going to be the FBI director, to give anybody a fair shake in the system.
What else didn't he trust, though, Professor? When you read this full and unconditional pardon, it's more sweeping than anything that we've seen since Nixon, according to most experts here, for those offenses against the U.S. which he has committed or may have committed or taken part in during a 10-year period. Clearly, the Biden family was expecting something else to come beyond the sentencing in the cases he was facing this month already. Is that how you see it?
That's how I see the breadth of the pardon, right? That it was the Trump victory coupled with the announcement of Kash Patel to run the FBI, Pam Bondi as the Attorney General, that those were the things that perhaps may, as I said, it's a reasonable inference that they may have prompted Biden to issue the pardon that he did in that kind of sweeping language, thinking that the investigations and prosecutions of Hunter Biden were not over. But it's worth noting that the statement talks about the prosecutions to date and the convictions of Hunter Biden to date as having been the product of essentially unjust and politically motivated prosecutions. And that's striking because, of course, that's not directly attributable to Trump or any of these people who Trump is putting forward. These were prosecutions that were undertaken by the special counsel, David Weiss, who was initially a U.S. attorney appointed by Trump, but who was carried over through the Biden administration and then ultimately given the status of special counsel to continue the investigations. So at least that chapter of Hunter Biden's criminal prosecutions, those did happen under the Joe Biden administration.
I know you're not a political analyst, Professor. There are questions about what this says about Joe Biden's legacy, having run on the idea that no one is above the law. But you are a legal expert, and we heard from the Speaker of the House today who echoed the sentiment of a lot of critics here in Washington. He wrote, quote, "Trust in our justice system has been almost irreparably damaged by the Bidens and their use and abuse of it." Is he right?
Well, I think that what I would have liked to see is this pardon, if Joe Biden were moved to issue it, accompanied by pardons of other people who've gone through the normal pardon and clemency process. People may not realize that there is an entire institutionalized process for seeking a pardon. And so I think what's particularly sort of striking about this, among other things, is it's for his own son. And of course, it's understandable on a human level that he would seek to pardon his son. And at the same time, there are thousands of other people who are not related to the president who have gone through the process of seeking a pardon or clemency. And so it would have been, I think, beneficial if Biden had, if he were going to do this, attached to it or at the same time focused his attention on applications that had gone through the process and been approved at multiple levels of the Department of Justice and at the White House for people who were not related to him. And so I certainly hope, for purposes of the rule of law and his legacy, that he turns attention to those petitions that have gone through the process immediately.
We've mentioned the name Kash Patel a couple of times on the program here and in our conversation. Professor, Donald Trump's new pick to run the FBI. Patel was on the Sean Ryan podcast back in September and had a couple of things to say about his plans for the agency if he were to run the FBI. Let's listen.
I'd shut down the FBI Hoover building on day one and reopening the next day as a museum of the deep state. And I'd take the 7,000 employees that work in that building and send them across America to chase down criminals. Go be cops. You're cops. Go be cops. Go chase down murderers and rapists and drug dealers and violent offenders. What do you need 7,000 people there for?
I drive by that building every day on my way home, Professor, and it's pretty ugly. It's even fallen apart, which is why they're moving it. But the idea of turning it into a museum of the deep state got some attention here, and I wonder your thoughts on this selection, whether you think he can be confirmed.
I don't know whether he can be confirmed, but his remarks in that little snip and other remarks that he's made are deeply troubling. He is not a suitable pick, to state it mildly, to run the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which does critical work to keep this nation safe from terrorism, from so many crimes. And it's critically important that the person who runs the FBI have the experience and the professionalism to undertake that critical work and oversee the thousands of employees there, most of whom are dedicated public servants who put their lives on the line. The notion that there's somebody who would be contemplated to be put in place there with the goal of essentially dismantling that critical agency is deeply, deeply troubling, to say nothing of the comments that he's made about targeting specific individuals for investigation and prosecution. The FBI must be independent of politics. And so it's the lack of experience, the stated objective of essentially dismantling this critical organization, and the political vengeance that are three strikes that really ought to take him out of the running for this position.
Jessica Roth is professor at Cardozo Law School, former federal prosecutor, with us today on Balance of Power. Professor, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, President-elect Trump threatening tariffs on China and on Mexico and Canada all last week. What would these tariffs look like practically, and how would they be implemented? Anna Wong of Bloomberg Economics games out the realities of the situation with us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Tariff.
Tariff. Tariff. I am a tariff man.
To me, the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff.
I want to cut taxes on Americans while putting tariffs on China and foreign countries.
Build your plant in the United States and you don't have any tariffs.
Donald Trump on the campaign trail, talking more than once about what he calls the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Joining us now for a deeper look at how the president-elect's tariff plans could be implemented and where they go from here is Bloomberg Economics chief U.S. economist Anna Wong. Anna, thanks for joining. You've got a great piece of reporting that you and Sean Donnan put together here on one of our deep dives in data-based journalism here. And I'd like to walk through some of this with you because we talk around tariffs on the regular here without too much information. And we are waiting for the incoming administration to provide more details. But you're providing a roadmap that gives us a bit of a sense of how this is going to go. Start with implementation and the way these would actually begin.
Right. So we considered the timing and the sequencing of these tariffs because, practically speaking, as a policymaker in the administration, I could imagine what they will have to consider. For example, what would be the offsetting policies to tariffs? Presumably, tariffs will hurt the stock market and also will lower growth. So this is the reason why we, in our war game, we think that a lot of the escalation will happen in 2026, because that was when the economy would be supported by the extension of TICTA and also other potential tax cuts that Donald Trump has proposed in the campaign trail. And it usually takes about a year for all these tax legislations to be written. This is why the bulk of it would happen in 2026 in our baseline. We also think that procedural, there are some faster track in the procedural, in terms of the procedure on how to get some tariffs enacted faster. And, for example, presidential powers. I think Trump was basically hinting at using presidential powers.
Well, that's
to do
what
so.
I'd like to ask you about, because you point out that it will be implemented in 3 waves.
Right.
Now we understand the timing based on what you just told us, but this would all be Donald Trump in the Oval Office with the Sharpie. That's what this will look like.
Yeah, so in this piece, my favorite sentence in this piece is how that we mentioned that there's the drama, which is the Donald Trump tweets, and also the actuality of the implementation. So
how different are they in the end?
Right. The drama is that Donald Trump will threaten to use presidential power, and there are certainly ways for which he could immediately, as he suggested in the tweet, to impose those tariffs via executive orders. But there's also other ways to do it in a more economically ways that makes more economic sense. Because I think another objective of Donald Trump, once he's moved his finger off the phone, the Twitter account, his advisors would be telling him, well, we need to think about the stock market, we need to think about inflation, we need to think about other offsetting policies, and that is what our baseline is crafted upon, that the strategic way of how to create the most bang on the tariff while limiting the economic damage.
As Scott Bessent has reminded us, you need these in totality to see them actually working. And a great work, and thank you. I'll point everyone to the roadmap through Trump's tariff realities and trade war drama on the terminal and online. Bloomberg Economics Chief U.S. Economist Anna Wong, we thank you for the insights, as always, today on Bloomberg. We're not done talking about tariffs yet. Coming up with world leaders getting ready for the next Trump administration, tariffs or not, my conversation with the British ambassador to the U.S., Dame Karen Pierce. No stranger to transitions in Washington. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. The transition to the incoming Trump administration has preoccupied all of Washington. That includes the diplomatic corps, where relationships equal results. Something I talked about with a veteran diplomat, Dame Karen Pierce, who's been the UK's ambassador to the U.S. since the first Trump administration. We sat down at the British ambassador's residence here in Washington as the embassy prepared to mark Winston Churchill's 150th birthday last weekend. A celebration complete with English sparkling wine and a reminder of our special relationship.
I've met President Trump and I know him, and that's certainly extremely helpful. Not all the people will be the same. Some of them we know from the Hill. I've met Senator Rubio, I've met Congressman Mike Waltz, very fine people. And then we'll just try and make as many new relationships as we can. And what we really want are not just friendly relations, obviously. We want productive ones. We want to get to a stage where you can have deep conversations about the direction of policy, whether that's Treasury, foreign policy, defense, or health.
You mentioned Mike Waltz. You do have a special relationship with him, if I can use that phrase, following your time serving as UK ambassador to Afghanistan. How has that helped to create a bond between the two of you. What are your conversations about?
Well, the first thing we talked about when we first met was Afghanistan. I actually met the congressman's wife first. That's how I knew he'd had this very distinguished service in Afghanistan, Green Beret, extremely impressive. But of course, Congressman Waltz has also worked on the policy side of earlier Republican administrations. And we have lots of stories about different parts of Afghanistan where we've each been. I should explain, I was an ambassador. I wasn't in the military. He's had a much more adventurous time than me.
Well, here we are sitting under the portrait of Winston Churchill on his 150th birthday. Pretty remarkable as we look at the landscape today and go back to that moment when he made the first framing of the Cold War. We talked about the Soviet threat.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
He talked about the Iron Curtain moving across Europe. What would he make of this moment in time that we're in now as we see an emboldened Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine?
I think he would feel that his instincts on Russia were proved right again. It was striking how, even though during the Second World War he was very ready to work with Stalin and the Russians because we had a common enemy, it was very striking how quickly his thoughts started to turn to the Soviet Union as antagonistic to the West, and he was proved right on that. Whether or not he'd call it another Iron Curtain, I don't know. I think it's something that Putin would like to do, to have more influence in Eastern Europe. You see it in some of the candidates standing in elections in East European countries. Some of them are close to Putin. But you also see other parts of Eastern Europe already in the European Union really want to solidify their relationships within the European Union and within NATO. So I think it is different. I think Churchill would be very pleased to see that NATO had its 75th anniversary.
What would he make of this debate then, particularly in the United States, about what to do with NATO, about whether to support the war in Ukraine, about what role the United States should play in this alliance?
He was a very firm believer in leadership by the United States. He had a rather elegant phrase about the old world giving way to the new, by which he meant the sorts of leadership roles Britain had played in the world in the 19th century would now be assumed by America. And I think he'd be very proud of NATO, which is fundamentally a defensive alliance, a political alliance. I think he'd be very proud of the way NATO has kept going. And I think overall he'd be here in America. He was half American, his mother was American, encouraging American leadership on the global stage.
To what extent, in your experience in the residence, the embassy, and to what extent you will continue to work here, have you been able to employ the tools of the embassy, whether it's the building that we're in, the architecture, the events that you put together here, or the bounties of the kingdom, whether it's a sparkling wine or a whiskey, a single malt that somebody might not have unless they were sitting down with you? This is all part of your job, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's exactly what diplomats do. Some people are unkind enough to imply that's all diplomats do. But I want to assure your audience that's not the case. We do as much with hard power. The defence, security, intelligence relationship between Britain and the US is vital. Again, Churchill, that same speech you mentioned, was the first time the phrase, the special relationship, was coined.
That's right.
So I just want to point that out. But you're right, soft power, we try to serve British produce at the embassy. We don't always succeed, but we do as much as we can. We have very good sparkling wine now.
Yes, right.
It is one of the very few positive things to emerge from climate change. It has made the south of the United Kingdom extremely prolific and proficient at producing sparkling wine.
What do you make of that? So climate change will make the UK the next major wine destination?
Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far. And there are lots of huge downsides to climate change.
Well,
but one of the things is this wonderful sparkling wine. So we try to serve that. I think all in all, we want the American people to be interested in Britain, and we want young Brits to be interested in America.
You're the first woman to have become the UK's permanent representative to the United Nations, Britain's first female ambassador to the US. That by definition makes you a pioneer. In that period of time, how has your business, the world of diplomacy, and Washington changed?
Oh, I've never been called a pioneer before.
Oh, I don't know about that.
I'm a city-loving, indoors person, so I'm very pleased to be called a pioneer. People always think diplomacy changes a lot, and the tools change. So obviously we have social media now, which is very relevant to soft power. Obviously we have iPhones and the internet. Where the internet was only just coming in when I was first here 30 years ago.
But also in that time, when you look up from the table, you see a more diverse room, and you see more women, do you not?
More women, more people of ethnic minority origin in Britain too. I mean, America is a very diverse society, and I think people don't always realise how diverse Britain is. Right. And one of the things we like to do in soft power is think of ways of celebrating and using that diversity to bring different groups of people together.
As we were discussing, this is the bounty of the UK. What do we have here?
This is an English sparkling wine from Kent. It's just won awards. It sells very well over here. We try and serve it whenever we can. Churchill's favourite champagne was Pol Roger, but that was because the English sparkling wine industry wasn't going in Churchill's day.
Got it.
So we're very proud of this and just delighted to be able to toast you and toast America.
What a treat. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
And thanks for having us at the embassy. Cheers.
Very good to see you. Thank you.
Over the weekend, Ambassador Pierce marked Churchill's 150th birthday with the captain and crew of the USS Winston S. Churchill, right in the room where we were speaking just now. Dame Pierce says her service in Washington is expected to end early next year, but that she'd stay for as long as the Prime Minister would like her to. As we came to air today on Bloomberg TV and radio to that end, we learned that President-elect Trump is now nominating Warren Stevens, CEO of Stevens Inc., as the U.S. ambassador to the UK. You can find more of our Uncorking Washington interviews on the terminal and online. Coming up on Balance of Power, Hunter Biden gets a presidential pardon, what that means for Joe Biden's legacy as he approaches the end of his term in the White House. Our signature political panel is up next. Rick and Jeannie on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Of course, I support the pardon of my son, said First Lady Dr. Jill Biden earlier today when asked if she indeed supports the pardon of Hunter Biden. Joining us now, our signature political panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. They are both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, I'll start with you as the Democrat and the extent to which people in your party are disappointed today in Joe Biden, having promised to not do this, having run on the message that no one is above the law. What does it mean for his legacy?
Yeah, I think it is going, we don't know. History takes time to develop, and we won't know how it impacts his legacy. But I think it is going to be something of a stain on his legacy. I think everybody can understand this is his son. And of course, as parents, it makes sense. But to me, the problem, and I think what some Democrats are struggling with, is the rationale he gave, which is directly, diametrically opposed to how he has presented himself. To suggest that this was a political persecution, a witch hunt, a miscarriage of justice, that is all Donald Trump language. And for him to sort of 360 flip it around and say all of a sudden that this is DOJ has been politicized after telling us for so long it wasn't, he is just opening a Pandora's box for Donald Trump to walk into, as he did last night, and say, hey, I'm justified in doing what I'm going to do with the J6, the people in prison, as he calls them, the J6 prisoners. And so it is distressing for many Democrats. While we understand it's his son, I wish he had just kept it at that. It's my son, and I'm going to pardon him.
So is that message that he tried to deliver, running for office and then running against Donald Trump? Remember, Trump would be the end of democracy. Donald Trump said that Joe Biden was weaponizing the Justice Department. Is all of this actually coming to fruition based on this pardon?
Yeah, I'm not sure who Joe Biden's blaming. Like, he thinks the Justice Department was weaponized against him?
Yeah.
Really? It's your Justice Department. Yeah, it's very confusing. I think it'll be a stain on, his legacy in that regard, because you can't have it one way in a campaign environment where the Justice Department is going after, for the first time in history, a former president, and then at the same time apply the same standard against the Justice Department for going against your son. Yeah. I agree with Jeannie. Very odd that we would have an agreement on a Monday. But
about Joe Biden?
This was one where Joe Biden either should have set it up better in advance or never have done it in the rears.
Well, I'll tell you, this apparently came from a family gathering on Nantucket. That's where the Bidens tend to spend their Thanksgivings every year. Jeannie, I don't know what was said or served at the Thanksgiving table, but there have been a lot of questions about some of the folks who Donald Trump has tapped to run the Department of Justice, for instance, or the FBI in the case of Kash Patel over the weekend. Is that what changed here?
It very likely could have been. The announcement, the timing is suspicious. The announcement that Kash Patel may be the director of the FBI, it came right before Joe Biden made this announcement. I'm hard-pressed to believe that was the only factor, certainly. But I do think it's reflective of the fact that Donald Trump has promised to and is intent on persecuting those people who went against him, who he feels wronged him, and he is trying to make sure they are in control of vast swaths of our judicial system. And this is so distressing because now you have Joe Biden saying that, yes, the DOJ is compromised. And so what is the American public to believe? Joe Biden started in Watergate. He headed the Senate Judiciary Committee. He ran on saying we can trust institutions in our government. And now he is saying, yeah, except when it pertains to my son. He is playing right into Donald Trump's playbook, and the naming of Kash Patel is directly the kind of thing that we expected from Donald Trump, and that it looks like may have scared Joe Biden enough to say that he was going to do this, even though he said and his press secretary said they weren't going to.
Well, let's get into Kash Patel here. This was what we thought might be our lead story today, announced over the weekend by President-elect Trump to run the FBI, someone who has vowed to dismantle the agency. But, of course, we have an FBI director. And the reaction here has been interesting. We heard on ABC this week, on Sunday morning, Republican Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota defending Chris Wray, the current FBI director, following Donald Trump's announcement. Listen.
Chris Wray, who the president nominated the first time around. And I think the president picked a very good man to be the director of the FBI when he did that in his first term. When we meet with him behind closed doors, I've had no objections to the way that he's handled himself. And so I don't have any complaints about the way that he's done his job right now.
Enter Senator Chuck Grassley, of course, the incoming chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, on X. Quote, Chris Wray has failed at fundamental duties of FBI director. He showed disdain for congressional oversight and has not lived up to his promises, unquote. Rick Davis, we talk about the dismantling of the FBI. Is this now going to be the dismantling of Christopher Wray in public?
It very well could be. I mean, we remember that Donald Trump appointed Christopher Wray in his first term.
What did he do wrong?
And FBI directors are supposed to serve 10-year terms so that they avoid the politicalization of the FBI. And I think what he did wrong was got in the way of Donald Trump's agenda, especially with the January 6th prosecutions, the role the FBI played in that in that activity. So, he got on the wrong side of Donald Trump, regardless of whether you're a friend or a foe. Yeah. Donald Trump is situational. And in this case, the situation calls for a new director of the FBI. And from what I can tell, there's enough support in the Senate to probably get Kash Patel through. Based on what we know today, right? And none of these people have been vetted yet, and so I hesitate saying anything's a easy vote right now for the United States Senate.
So how does this end, Jeannie? Does Director Wray resign, or does Donald Trump fire him?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. He could also resign pending his successor being successfully confirmed, and if that doesn't happen, potentially Donald Trump could then name Kash Patel as acting director and not have to go through the vetting process in the Senate. I want to hope that Rick Davis is wrong and that Kash Patel does not get through. Maybe somebody can read his children's book out loud and see if somebody who would put pen to paper in that way actually has the temperament to be the director of the FBI and keep the country secure. He is somebody who traffics in conspiracy theories. They are dangerous, and he has been very vocal about them. So whether he has the expertise or not, he does not have the temperament, and hopefully there are 4 senators on the Republican side who will vote against him.
The Plot Against the King, one of 3 children's books, as we learned today, written by Kash Patel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, stay with us, because coming up, we turn to Congress back this week for the lame duck session with a race to finish their agenda, or at least keep the government from closing this month. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We need to keep divisive and unnecessary provisions out of any government funding extension. For now, I'm pleased negotiations are on the right track, and I thank the appropriators in both chambers for their good work.
December drama is not the way to demonstrate we're serious about our most basic governing responsibilities.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senate Minority Leader, at least for now, Mitch McConnell, speaking on the floor earlier today. They're back addressing efforts to avoid a government shutdown before the holidays. And back with us, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, who've been through a couple of funding deadlines. So, Rick, maybe you more than the rest of us, the 20th of December, nobody's talking about a shutdown. The question is, how far do we kick the can down the road?
Yeah, well, hopefully they can get to the 20th of December with a funding bill. And the question is, how long is it going to last? Probably through March, from what we're hearing. But they still have work to do. They've got to do an NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which has always been done by every Congress before the end of the year. So they got to get that done. And they've got to also get disaster assistance. Everybody, it's just the same thing. Everybody's for the NDAA. Everybody's for disaster assistance. Everybody's for the continuing resolution.
So they write it.
Nobody can get the vote done.
Sure. What do you think here, Jeannie? Because there's an opportunity to clear the decks, as they say, for Donald Trump. How far down the road should the can be kicked in government funding? Is it March? Is it the whole year? Or are you going to make a last-ditch effort for regular order?
I try to push for regular order. I'm not holding out hope. I think we're probably going to get March, so they do it right before the sequester kicks in. And of course, the reality is you've got Donald Trump, his OMB director designee, talking about big cuts, and also, of course, extending the tax cuts. How you do both, the spending and the tax cuts at the same time. So they're going to get a CR, but that's just going to make what happens next with a House majority as thin as the Republicans are going to have it. And even the Senate is pretty tight, that much more difficult.
How tight is the question? There's still one House race to be called, Rick. California's 13th district. They're 190 votes apart here. It is entirely likely that Mike Johnson will have this majority of one when the other members, assuming are confirmed, go to the administration. He better use his time wisely here.
That's right. That San Joaquin Valley is a swing Democratic seat, and it looks like it's swinging Democratic right now.
You think so?
Well, it's 190 votes. I mean, I'd rather have the 190 and not be behind.
That's right.
So, it's going to create an even worse pressure on majority or on the Speaker and the Republican caucus in the House. I would be stunned that anything can happen in a Congress where there's literally 1 or 2 Republicans cross the aisle and they can control the entire Congress.
Imagine that. So do we need a power-sharing agreement here? Jeannie, will Democrats help Mike Johnson keep his job?
I don't know if they will, but, the reality is if, somebody gets sick, their child has a concert, there is a point at which Democrats could actually go on the floor and take it over. I mean, it is that tight. So we're going to have to watch every day. Is anybody out? Does Kathy Hochul slow walk this Elise Stefanik special election that's going to have to occur? There's so many aspects of this that can utterly disrupt any ability for Congress, particularly in the House, to pass these bills.
Yeah, there are no ties in the House. Jeannie Shanzano, Rick Davis, thank you so much. Our signature panel on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Just think of where we'll be by Friday. To that end, check out the Washington Edition newsletter. Find it on the terminal and online to catch up on everything that happened over the holiday weekend. And we'll see you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.